More than 30,000 runners gathered before sunrise for the California International Marathon in Sacramento, California. Elite athletes adjusted their racing shoes. Recreational runners stretched nervously, and thousands of spectators lined the streets waiting for the starting gun. Standing quietly near the back of the oldest age group corral was an 80-year-old man wearing a faded blue marathon jacket, well-worn running shoes that had clearly seen countless miles, and a race bib pinned carefully to his chest. Leaning lightly on a wooden cane before the race began, Harold "Harry" Whitman looked nothing like the competitors around him. Several younger runners smiled sympathetically. One whispered, "I hope someone picks him up before mile 5. Another laughed softly. "He'll probably spend more time at the medical tent than on the course." Harry simply smiled, folded his cane, handed it to a volunteer for safekeeping, and quietly walked toward the starting line. Moments before the race began, the announcer suddenly paused after noticing his name on the participant list. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "before today's marathon begins, I'd like everyone to welcome our oldest registered runner, Mr. Harold Whitman." Polite applause filled the starting area. Then the race director walked over, shook Harry's hand with both of his, and added, "Many of you don't recognize him today, but decades ago, this man completed 27 consecutive marathons after surviving injuries doctors once said would prevent him from ever running again." The crowd fell silent. Resting inside Harry's old canvas gear bag near the starting line was a weathered training journal documenting more than 50 years of running, along with one sealed letter from the coach who had first taught him that a marathon is never a race against other runners. It is a conversation between the human spirit and the decision to take one more step. The streets of Sacramento came alive before sunrise as more than 30,000 runners gathered for the annual California International Marathon. Music echoed through the starting area, while volunteers handed out water, race maps, and timing chips. Elite athletes warmed up near the front, their conversations filled with target times, split strategies, and qualification standards for the Boston Marathon. Recreational runners stretched beside friends, taking photographs before the long journey ahead. Near the very back of the starting corrals stood an 80-year-old man named Harold "Harry" Whitman. He wore a faded blue marathon jacket over a simple running shirt, lightweight black running shorts, well-worn racing shoes that had clearly carried him through thousands of miles, and an old digital wristwatch, whose scratched face had measured decades of early morning runs. Before entering the starting area, Harry leaned gently on a polished wooden cane. After reaching the corral, he quietly folded the cane, placed it inside an old canvas gear bag, and handed the bag to a race volunteer with a warm smile. Several younger runners watched with curiosity. One whispered, "He's actually running?" Another smiled politely. "I hope he knows there's no shame in stopping early." A third laughed softly. "The medical team will probably catch him before mile 5. Harry heard every word but simply smiled as he adjusted the race bib pinned carefully to his shirt. A young volunteer approached him with genuine concern. "Good morning, sir," she said kindly. "If at any point you don't feel well, please tell one of the medical staff. Safety comes first." Harry nodded gratefully. "Thank you," he replied. "I've learned that lesson many times." Assuming he was simply an elderly participant fulfilling a personal dream, she wished him luck before moving to assist other runners. Around the starting area, conversations focused on the elite field expected to break the course record. Television cameras followed famous marathon champions, while commentators discussed race strategy. Almost no one noticed Harry quietly standing alone near the back of the crowd, calmly watching the sunrise over the city. Just minutes before the starting gun, race director Daniel Foster reviewed the final participant list one last time. Suddenly, his eyes stopped on a familiar name. "Harry Whitman?" he whispered. Looking toward the oldest starting corral, he immediately spotted the elderly runner standing quietly among thousands of competitors. Without hesitation, Daniel walked away from the announcer's platform and made his way through the crowd. Runners looked around in confusion as the race director approached Harry with a broad smile. Reaching him, Daniel extended both hands warmly. "Mr. Whitman," he said, "I was hoping you'd come back this year." Harry smiled. "I wasn't sure my knees would agree." Daniel laughed softly. "After everything you've already overcome," he gently shook Harry's hand. "I'm not betting against you." Curious runners nearby began wondering who the elderly man really was. Daniel turned toward the announcer's stand and nodded. Moments later, The announcer's voice echoed across the starting line. Ladies and gentlemen, before today's marathon begins, we'd like to recognize a very special participant. Thousands of runners looked around. Standing among you today is Mr. Harold Whitman, the oldest runner in this year's race. Polite applause spread through the crowd. Then Daniel added something that immediately changed the atmosphere. Many years ago, doctors told Mr. Whitman he would never run again after a devastating accident. Complete silence followed. Since then, Daniel smiled toward Harry. He has completed 27 marathons. The applause grew louder. Harry looked almost embarrassed by the attention. As he bent down to tighten one final shoelace, the zipper of his old canvas gear bag accidentally slipped open. Inside rested a weathered training journal filled with handwritten entries dating back more than 50 years. Beneath it lay a sealed envelope written in elegant blue ink. Across the front were only a few words. For Harry, open this when people finally understand that finishing is sometimes the greatest victory of all. The starting horn echoed across downtown Sacramento, and thousands of runners surged forward through the city streets. Elite athletes immediately settled into a blistering pace, while recreational runners searched for a comfortable rhythm among the enormous crowd. Harry Whitman crossed the starting line nearly 4 minutes after the leaders. He never hurried. He never looked at the runners disappearing ahead of him. Instead, he glanced once at his old digital watch, smiled quietly, and settled into the same steady pace he had practiced for decades. Several younger runners passed him within the first mile. One looked back and encouraged him with a friendly smile. "Take it easy, sir." Another laughed with his friends. "We'll probably see him riding in the medical cart before halfway." Harry simply waved and continued running without changing his stride. His breathing remained calm, his shoulders relaxed, and every step landed with remarkable consistency. Around mile 6, the field had begun spreading out across the course. Many runners who had started too fast were already slowing down, while Harry continued moving with almost exactly the same rhythm he had maintained from the opening mile. A young runner named Ethan Parker noticed the elderly man gradually drawing closer. "How are you still running the same pace?" he asked between heavy breaths. Harry smiled. "Because I didn't borrow any speed from the future." Ethan looked puzzled. Harry continued. "Every fast mile you can't afford. You'll have to repay later." Ethan nodded thoughtfully as Harry quietly moved ahead. Near mile 10, television cameras filming the race briefly focused on Harry after commentators realized he was the oldest participant in the field. One broadcaster remarked, "Look at that running form. There's almost no wasted movement." Another replied, "You can tell he's been doing this for a very long time." At the halfway point, dozens of runners stopped beside medical stations to stretch cramped muscles or treat blisters. Harry slowed only long enough to thank each volunteer offering water, before continuing at exactly the same steady pace. Race director Daniel Foster watched the live timing screens with growing admiration. "He's almost perfectly even," he whispered. Every 5-kilometer split differed by only a few seconds. A volunteer standing beside him asked, "How does someone his age still run like that?" Daniel smiled. "Because he stopped racing other people many years ago." The race entered its most difficult section after mile 20. Spectators called it the wall, the place where exhausted runners often struggled physically and mentally. Many athletes who had confidently sprinted past Harry early in the morning were now walking, stretching, or sitting along the roadside, waiting for medical assistance. Harry quietly continued forward, passing one runner after another. Ethan Parker, now struggling with painful leg cramps, looked up in surprise as Harry caught him again. "I thought I was faster than you," Ethan admitted. Harry smiled gently. "You were." He pointed ahead. For the first half, Ethan laughed despite his exhaustion. "What's your secret?" Harry looked toward the road stretching into the distance. "Never run today's mile with tomorrow's strength." Ethan watched the elderly runner disappear steadily down the course. There was nothing spectacular about Harry's speed. There was no dramatic sprint or incredible burst of athletic power. There was only patience, discipline, and 50 years of experience teaching him exactly how much effort each mile deserved. As Harry approached mile 23, spectators lining the streets began recognizing him from the morning announcement. Applause followed him from one neighborhood to the next. Children held out their hands for high fives while volunteers cheered louder every time the oldest runner passed another exhausted competitor. Then one television camera zoomed in on Harry's face just as he quietly reached into the pocket of his faded marathon jacket tied around his waist. For a brief moment, He gently touched a folded photograph he had carried through every marathon for nearly 3 decades, before placing it carefully back into his pocket. No one watching the race knew whose picture it was, or why the old runner smiled every time he felt it. They only knew that whatever gave Harry Whitman the strength to keep moving had been with him far longer than any medal waiting at the finish line. By mile 24, the California sun had climbed high above Sacramento, and exhaustion was visible across the marathon course. Medical volunteers treated runners suffering from dehydration and muscle cramps, while thousands of spectators continued encouraging every athlete still fighting toward the finish line. Harry Whitman remained steady. His pace had slowed slightly, but every stride looked almost identical to the first mile. He neither glanced at the runners ahead nor worried about those behind him. His attention remained fixed on the next step, then the next one after that. Near mile 25, Ethan Parker finally caught up beside him again. Breathing heavily, he smiled. "Can I ask you something?" Harry nodded. Of course. Ethan hesitated before speaking. "Back there, I saw you touch a photograph." Harry smiled softly. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he reached into the pocket of the faded marathon jacket tied around his waist and carefully unfolded the worn photograph. It showed a smiling young woman standing beside Harry at the finish line of a marathon many years earlier. Both of them wore race medals around their necks. "My wife?" Harry said quietly. Ethan looked at the photograph. "She ran too?" Harry nodded. "Every marathon after my accident." Ethan looked surprised. "The doctors told me I'd never run again after I broke my back in a construction accident." He smiled faintly. She never believed them. Harry carefully brushed a thumb across the faded picture. "Every morning before sunrise, she woke up with me." His voice remained calm. "Every mile I wanted to quit, she walked beside me." Ethan looked around. "Is she waiting at the finish?" Harry gently shook his head. "No." After a brief silence, he added quietly, "She passed away 11 years ago." Ethan lowered his eyes. Harry smiled, not with sadness, but with gratitude. "She never missed a marathon." He touched the photograph again. "She still doesn't." Neither man spoke for several moments as they continued running side by side. At that moment, television cameras filming the race caught the conversation from a distance. The commentators remained silent. After learning the story through Harry's race registration notes, thousands of spectators watching the live broadcast suddenly understood why the oldest runner carried that small photograph through every marathon. As Harry approached the final mile, the crowds along the streets began clapping in rhythm with his footsteps. More and more runners who had already finished returned to the course, lining the barriers to cheer for the elderly man, making his way toward the finish line. Race director Daniel Foster quietly watched the live timing screen before smiling. "He's going to finish," he whispered. One volunteer nodded. He never looked like he doubted it. Daniel replied softly. Neither did she. Just a few hundred meters from the finish, Harry reached into the pocket of his old canvas gear bag that volunteers had delivered to the finishing area. From inside, he carefully removed his weathered training journal. Tucked between its pages rested the same sealed envelope that had remained unopened for years. Across the front, written in elegant blue ink, were only a few words, "For Harry, open this when you finally understand that the finish line was never where your journey was leading." Harry looked at the familiar handwriting for a long moment before quietly slipping the envelope back inside the journal. Then he smiled, straightened his shoulders, gently folded the photograph once more, and began the final few hundred meters toward a finish line that meant far more than completing another marathon. As Harry Whitman entered the final stretch, the finish line was no longer focused on the winners who had crossed hours earlier. Thousands of spectators now stood on both sides of the course, applauding the 80-year-old runner with every step he took. Volunteers, medical staff, race officials, elite athletes, and runners who had already finished all turned their attention toward the man who had quietly become the heart of the marathon. Harry never accelerated. He never attempted a dramatic sprint. He crossed the finish line exactly as he had run every mile of the race, with calm determination, steady breathing, and quiet gratitude. The moment his timing chip recorded the finish, the entire finish area erupted into a standing ovation. Race director Daniel Foster walked forward, placed the finisher's medal around Harry's neck, and shook both of his hands. "Congratulations, Harry," he said warmly. "You reminded all of us what this race is really about." Harry smiled gently. "Thank you." He looked around at the cheering crowd. "I only kept moving." Daniel laughed softly. "That's exactly why they're applauding. Nearby, Ethan Parker finally crossed the finish line a few minutes later. Still exhausted, he walked directly toward Harry before giving him a grateful hug. "You didn't just help me finish today," Ethan said quietly. "You changed the way I'll run for the rest of my life." Harry smiled. Then today was a good day. A volunteer handed Harry his old canvas gear bag. He slowly opened it and removed the weathered training journal that had accompanied him through more than 50 years of running. Resting inside was the sealed envelope he had carried for so long. Daniel looked at him with a smile. "Do you think today's the day?" Harry looked at the familiar handwriting before carefully opening the envelope. The paper inside had become yellow with age. He adjusted his glasses and began reading aloud. "Dear Harry, if you are opening this letter, then people have finally stopped looking at your age and started looking at your courage." The crowd fell completely silent. Harry continued, "Many runners believe the finish line is where the marathon ends. They are mistaken. The marathon ends the moment you decide you are no longer willing to take another step." Several runners quietly lowered their eyes. Harry unfolded the second page. "One day your legs will become slower. Your records will disappear. Younger runners will pass you without even knowing your name. Let them. Your greatest race has never been against another runner." He smiled softly before reading the final paragraph. "If anyone ever asks what it means to finish a marathon, tell them this. Finishing is not proof that your body was the strongest. It is proof that your spirit refused to surrender after your body asked it to." Harry slowly folded the letter and returned it to the journal. No one spoke for several long moments. Then Daniel signaled toward the main stage near the finish line. A large curtain quietly dropped, revealing a permanent display prepared without Harry's knowledge. Inside a polished glass case rested his faded blue marathon jacket, worn running shoes, old digital watch, weathered training journal, the photograph of his late wife, and the letter from his longtime coach. Above them stood a bronze plaque engraved with the words, "The Harold Whitman Endurance Legacy," dedicated to the runner who taught generations that the greatest victory is not crossing the finish line before others, but refusing to stop before reaching your own. As the applause echoed across the finish area once again, Harry looked toward the photograph of his wife, gently touched the medal resting on his chest, and smiled. For the first time in many years, the finish line did not feel like the end of another marathon. It felt like the beginning of a lesson thousands of people would carry with them long after the race numbers had been removed and the roads had become quiet again. The story of Harold "Harry" Whitman quickly spread far beyond Sacramento. At first, newspapers described the inspiring image of the oldest runner in the California International Marathon, crossing the finish line to a standing ovation, after thousands of spectators waited just to see him finish. But as runners learned about Harry's journey, his accident, the decades of disciplined training, and the photograph of his late wife he carried through every marathon, the story became far more than an athletic achievement. It became a lesson about perseverance, love, and the quiet strength required to keep taking one more step when life becomes difficult. 1 year later, the organizers of the California International Marathon invited Harry to deliver the opening address before the starting gun. More than 30,000 runners stood together in the cool morning air, expecting a motivational speech about endurance or racing strategy. Instead, Harry walked onto the stage carrying only his weathered training journal. He slowly opened it and read the first sentence written on the opening page more than 50 years earlier. "Run the mile you are in. The next one will wait for you." He quietly closed the journal again. "People often ask me what the hardest marathon of my life was," he began. "The truth is," he smiled softly, "it wasn't any marathon." The crowd became completely silent. The hardest race was learning to believe I could walk again after the accident. He rested one hand on the journal. "Once I learned that, every marathon simply became another opportunity to say thank you." Many runners quietly lowered their heads. Harry continued, "The greatest mistake young runners make is believing they are racing against everyone around them." He smiled gently. "You're not." Looking across the thousands of competitors waiting at the starting line, he added, "The only person you must never allow to defeat you is the one who whispers that you should give up." Race director Daniel Foster, standing nearby, smiled as he listened. At the conclusion of the ceremony, the organizers unveiled the Harold Whitman Endurance Center, created to preserve the story of a runner who had inspired an entire community. Inside the exhibit rested Harry's faded blue marathon jacket, worn running shoes, old digital watch, weathered training journal, finisher's medals collected over decades, the photograph of his late wife, and the letter from his coach, visitors expected the first display to celebrate marathon victories or personal records. Instead, they found a single handwritten sentence displayed beneath soft lighting: "Take the next step, then decide again." Every new participant collecting a race bib for the California International Marathon was invited to stop before that display before entering the starting area. Years later, after Harold Whitman peacefully passed away at the age of 95, runners from around the world gathered in Sacramento for a special memorial run. There were no official race rankings, prize money, or championship titles. Instead, thousands of runners carried handwritten notes describing the obstacle they had refused to surrender to in their own lives, before placing them beside Harry's portrait. Above the entrance to the Harold Whitman Endurance Center, a bronze inscription welcomed every future runner with the words that would forever define his legacy: "The finish line is never the greatest achievement. Becoming the person who refuses to stop is." Those who visited the center often admired the old marathon jacket, the worn shoes, the faded photograph, and the journal that had traveled through more than 50 years of running. But those who truly understood Harold Whitman's life realized that his greatest accomplishment had never been completing 27 marathons. It was teaching generations of people that endurance is measured not by how fast we move, but by the courage to keep moving after life gives us every reason to stop. The story of Harold "Harry" Whitman soon spread far beyond the California International Marathon. At first, newspapers described the emotional moment when thousands of runners and spectators remained at the finish line for hours just to cheer for the oldest participant in the race. But as people learned about Harry's accident, his remarkable recovery, the decades of disciplined training, and the photograph of his late wife that had accompanied him through every marathon, the story became much more than one runner crossing a finish line. It became a reminder that the greatest victories in life are often invisible until someone refuses to give up. In the years that followed, Harry's story was shared at marathon expos, running clubs, rehabilitation centers, schools, military academies, and hospitals across the country, not because he ran faster than everyone else, not because he broke world records, but because he proved that true endurance has very little to do with speed and everything to do with character. Whenever young runners asked Harry how they could become stronger, he always smiled before giving the same answer. "Don't train only your legs," he would say. "Train the part of you that decides whether to take the next step when your legs no longer want to." During his final public appearance before the California International Marathon, Harry walked onto the starting stage carrying only his weathered training journal. Instead of talking about race tactics, nutrition, or finishing times, he quietly removed a single blank race bib from between its pages and held it up for everyone to see. Thousands of runners stood in complete silence. Harry smiled gently. "Every marathon begins with a number," he said, "but none of us remembers people because of the number they wore." He paused before continuing. "We remember them because they refused to stop moving when life became difficult." Carefully placing the blank bib back inside the journal, he looked across the crowd one final time. "The finish line doesn't decide who you are," he smiled. "It simply reveals the person you chose to become during all the miles before it." The entire starting area rose in a standing ovation long before the race had even begun. Years after Harold Whitman peacefully passed away, his faded blue marathon jacket, worn running shoes, old digital watch, weathered training journal, and the photograph of his beloved wife remained preserved inside the Harold Whitman Endurance Center. Above them hung a simple bronze plaque carrying the words that every runner read before collecting a race bib. Courage is not measured by how quickly you reach the finish. It is measured by how many times you choose to keep going after you wanted to stop. Visitors often admired the medals, photographs, and memories of a remarkable marathon runner, but those who truly understood Harry Whitman's life realized that his greatest achievement had never been finishing 27 marathons. His greatest achievement was teaching generations of ordinary people that every difficult journey, whether on a marathon course or in life itself, is completed the same way. Not with one extraordinary leap, but with the quiet courage to take one more step and then another, until the impossible slowly becomes the past.